I'm Liz Stahl, Extension Educator in Crops out of the Worthington Regional Office. And one of the great things about having this program online, we can bring in experts from other states. So again, I'm happy to introduce one of our speakers today. It's Dan Smith. He's an outreach specialist in nutrient and pest management with the University of Wisconsin. Has done a lot of work with cover crops. So again, it'll be great to have him joining us today. And then also Dr. Anna Cates. She's our U of M state soil health specialist. And of course, she's done a lot of work with soil health and cover crops as well. Again, with that, I will turn it over to our speakers for today, and we'll start with Dan here. So Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to you and Anna for the invite to present today. Excited to be sharing some of the stuff that we saw in Southwest Wisconsin after talking to Anna. It sounds like, unfortunately, Minnesota experienced some very similar conditions. So we're going to be talking about how dry it really was in Southwest Wisconsin and really kind of the upper Midwest, and what that did to our crops, and then how cover crops are formed in some of these systems. So 2023 was dry, we know that, but it was especially dry from planting until the 4th of July. So at my house, I received 0 inches of rain, zero precipitation between May 6th and the 4th of July. This data here on this slide is showing the Arlington Research Station. The very bold black line on the screen is the weather from 2013 or 2023 rather. And then you can see the departure from the normal line, which is indicated in the blue line across the portion of the screen. So it's very dry at Lancaster. We were about 10 inches below normal precipitation levels. So shockingly dry. So we went out and we dug some plants right away because June was admittedly a tough month. I received a lot of calls that some of our recommendations were struggling out in the field. And I really wanted to dig into why and what we could learn from this year. So we went out and we dug some plants. This is from our cropping system study. We have a full tillage treatment, a no-till treatment, and a planted green treatment where we're planting into about foot tall rye. When we dug into the full till system, the corn was admittedly 2 growth stages ahead and the soil was powder dry. We dug up about 6 to 8 inches of roots that is shown on a tailgate of a pickup truck, and the roots were completely dry. We move into a no-till system. The roots hadn't gone down as far looking for moisture, so it was a little bit encouraging that there was some more moisture present. However, the soil was still awfully dry. And then what we were really surprised about was when we dug some plants in our planted green study. This was planted green, and then the rye was terminated at planting, so we didn't let it go and try and compete with the corn or anything. But the soil moisture was in the top 2 inches, and we had some really good soil tilth. So that was really encouraging to us. The moisture was there. The plants were being held back a little bit by the rye residue, possibly by some other environmental interactions, but we had soil moisture. The rye hadn't stolen all of it yet. So we were encouraged by that. And then we started looking at our soybeans treatments. We have the same study for soybeans as well, which I'll talk through in a couple more slides. Soybeans looked fine. They really weren't struggling. There was a little bit of potassium deficiency, but they were looking really good in that high residue environment. So cover cropping and soil moisture concerns were maybe not as much as what they looked like from the road. So I would encourage everyone to go out and dig some plants up. This is also encouraging for us. I do a lot of work with nitrogen management. As my previous role was about 80% nutrient management in Wisconsin. So we do some trials looking at planting corn into rye residue and then applying different nitrogen treatments to see what the ideal nitrogen rate is. And these are zero nitrogen strips. So we applied zero nitrogen. So this was, you would think nitrogen would be a very limiting factor, but the corn plants are really green yet. They had focused on some really good root growth and development. There hadn't been a lot of water to necessarily flush through all the excess nitrates from the previous year through the soil profile yet. So they were surviving quite well, even though they had zero nitrogen applied to them. We saw some really good yields in this trial because that rye residue really helped retain moisture. We did see some planting issues, though. As we allowed biomass to increase, there was some real issues. And this is when we let the rye grow and take over the corn, essentially, where we terminated 2 weeks after planting. That's not going to be a best management recommendation in a dry year. We were pushing the system a little bit, but where we terminated 2 weeks post-planting, the rye overtook the corn, smothered out the corn, and really did negatively hurt us, especially when it came to yield or biomass production for corn silage. Because that is a photo taken the same day, June 27th, where we have our heavy rye residue versus our no-till system. Huge difference throughout the year. What we saw more than maybe soil moisture challenges, though, was planter issues. So whenever we didn't have planting depth set quite right and we planted into those powder dry soils, we saw a lot of emergent issues. So we saw some corn coming up at uneven growth stages, and that stuck around until at least the 4th of July when we did finally get some more rain. Where we had plants out in the field that were V7 to V8 next to plants that were V2 to V3. So making weed management decision making very challenging due to herbicide label restrictions, making the decision to side dress those fields with additional nitrogen really challenging. And then they looked terrible. They looked really bad from the road. There was a lot of questions on what we were going to have to do to these fields, whether we should replant, plant an alternative forage, that type of thing. But again, patience was key as we did get a few timely rains, even though we did finish below normal. Our yields were, I would say, adequate, and people were not maybe happy, but they were satisfied with the yield levels that we saw. So those are some of those planter issues where we didn't get soil moisture. Those plants came up later on in the growing season. We had fields that looked like this. And then finally, that last photo was of the potassium deficiency. Remember that soil moisture is only one piece of the puzzle, though, as we're going into another dry year. Unfortunately, it's dry throughout the upper Midwest. Again, I'm sitting today in Lincoln, Nebraska, as I met with them today, yesterday rather, on their on-farm research network, and we're really interested in creating a similar system in Wisconsin. It's dry across the Midwest. We have to remember that soil moisture is only one factor, so we really need to have a strong management plan for managing our soil structure, managing our soil fertility, our weeds, our insects, and finally picking the right varieties and hybrids, which have more than likely already been done by this time. But all those are little pieces of the puzzle that end up resulting in big implications. And at the end of the day, the hybrid and variety probably was more important last year than many of our other management decisions, because it seemed like some of those corn hybrids really held up well under those dry conditions. So before I move into a little bit more data heavy portion of the presentation, 2013 or June 2023 was rough. We needed to go out to the field and dig some plants. This is Tony Pyrick, a Dodge County farmer that's really leading a lot of regenerative ag practices in southern Wisconsin, adopting those very early on his farm. This was in the peak of our temporary drought conditions in southern Wisconsin, and his fields looked excellent. He has been able to build up a lot of organic matter in his soils. He's been able to retain a lot of water in his soils because of that, and also because he keeps his soils covered year round with various mixes of cover crops. So it was really rewarding to go out and kind of reassuring to go out and dig some plants with Tony and kind of look at what things were going on. And you can see the soil moisture there. Again, this was taken just a few days apart from those plants I showed on my very first slide. So that moisture retention is really a big component of success. So we've been looking at integrating cover crops into systems the last couple of years. And the thirsty cover crop topic came about today is really interesting to me because we've been doing this for 6 years now. And we've had some pretty wet years in the beginning, 2018 and 2019. And now finally we had our first dry year, which we'd expect, say, every 10 years or so to look at. So we have some data now to talk about. We're doing these on silt loam soils in southern Wisconsin at our Arlington and Lancaster farm. And we established these in 2018. And they're a corn soybean rotation where we have a cornfield and a soybean field trial at each location every single year. And our treatments for this study include a full tillage treatment. So it's fairly common in Southwest Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota. We have a no-till system. We have our rye systems where we planted winter rye the following year at about a bushel per acre. This last year, we've been using an early maturing rye, which has seemed to build a little bit more biomass earlier on in the season. So we terminate 2 weeks before planting. Now, at the time of the study design, was the recommendation from crop insurance. Now, those rules have changed. Not an expert on those, so I'll let that go for today. But that was the previous recommendation. Then we have our planting termination timing, or what we would call planting green, our late termination timing, where we spray the rye off 2 weeks after, and our forage timing. The weather was really extreme for us in Southwest Wisconsin this year. Again, precipitation levels were the lowest of our trial years for June and August. July actually wasn't necessarily a train wreck per se, but it was certainly very dry. And you see there the 30-year data is in purple on the slide. And these slides are courtesy of Jacob Felsman, a graduate student leading this project currently, and Colby Grant previously led this project at the Lancaster and Arlington farm. So it was very dry. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly for the sake of time. Cereal rye biomass was a really big component of the study. We want to get to about 4,000 pounds of biomass to suppress weeds. We were able to do that in our late termination timing fairly regularly. We almost made it there this year in our corn treatment at Arlington, 3,800 pounds. and we did it in our late termination timing at Lancaster, 5,600 pounds. So that's kind of the level we're getting to, we're trying to get to. But as you can see, there's a lot of numbers a lot lower than that. Our early termination timing, our very first year, was 70 pounds in soybeans at Arlington and 156 pounds at Lancaster. That's really tough to even see that amount of biomass out in the field. So what do things look at the end of the season? And this is 2022 versus 2023. What's shocking is how green the corn is, yet taking very similar timing at near harvest timing, yet at the fall. So this year we got a lot of moisture later on in the season, and that helped kind of extend our season. I think it helped maybe add to test weight at the end of the day. So that was interesting to see that the corn didn't dry down as quickly this year, even though the conditions were much drier, 10 inches below normal again at the farm. So we can think about that as maybe being a hybrid factor as well, having the right hybrid for the right location. Soybeans, we did not notice that, but you can notice some weeds there in some of the plots being indicated as the green because our herbicide activation was very poor. So we did not see very good herbicide performance of our pre-emergent herbicides in these studies. That's a big component. You can see some weeds popping through here in the pre-plots fairly regularly where we didn't have rye residue. Where we had rye residue, didn't seem to matter. And again, the greenest plots are where we did not have a pre-emergent herbicide at all. But compare that to 2022, where we had good rain to activate our second application, we have very clean plots. So everybody asked about yield. Our yields have been phenomenal from this study. And I'm showing Arlington. Arlington is somewhat of a garden spot in Wisconsin. We're very fortunate to have really good soils at Arlington, but we have very similar yields at Lancaster. Last year, we had about 230 bushels per acre on our conventional till, our no-till, and our early termination planting timing for our rye. So we planted into rye residue and we got very similar yields. That's an incredible take home. Statistically, they're the same. So that means there's plots that are a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and averaged out, and then we separated the means, and they're the same. We did see a little bit of a yield drag when we had more biomass. So we're going to recommend in a dry year, if you're planting corn, to terminate the rye before you plant. That was hard for me to really accept because I'm a big fan of the biomass and the power of the rye biomass. So I would hold on to that as long as you can, but have a plan to terminate before you plant to avoid any yield competition. Because we've actually seen some similar effects in previous years where we do see a little bit of reduction in yield if we're not using a pre-emergent herbicide with the more rye biomass we have for corn. So that's the story for corn. We did take a pretty significant yield penalty when we had all that biomass out for a late termination timing. There was about, say, maybe a foot, a knee high, say like 2 foot tall rye out in those plots by the time we planted. Where we cut the rye for rylage, that would be statistically the same as our at plant termination timing. So we were encouraged by that because we had seen the soil dry out so much after we harvest that rye plot. It's just the soil is exposed to all the sunlight and dries out quicker. Soybeans, it doesn't matter. Soybeans on average, though, were low yielding for us. We typically grow 60 to 80 bushel soybeans. I have seen 99 bushel soybeans in our plots at Lancaster for this study. We had 45 bushel soybeans this last year, very much so contributed to the dry weather, probably some planting challenges as well. But statistically, we are the same as long as we include a pre-emergent herbicide. I know that we look at those and there's quite a bit of variation there across the graph, but again, there's some plots that yield a little bit better than others, and that makes that mean separation come out to be the same or very similar. So for soybeans, doesn't matter when you terminate the rye, always include a pre-emergent herbicide. That's the take home. With that, we're going to do questions at the end. I will turn it on over to Anna.
Thanks, Dan. Great data, and that definitely makes my job a little easier. You explained a lot of what you might want to know. Okay. And you do have a couple questions in the chat, Dan, if you feel like typing while I talk,
Yeah,
that would be
or
available.
yeah, if Dan wants to answer those out loud or anything too.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Dan, if you want.
So there was
Okay.
one quick question. Yeah, well, I've got two actually here. Did the late termination timing dry out the soil too much, do you think? That was one question that had popped up.
That's a great question. I would say that that was definitely a factor that the rye had taken up quite a bit more moisture in those 2 weeks that we allowed it to grow and compete with the corn. Did it dry it out too much is a tough question to ask because it seems like our soil conditions are pretty favorable after even that late termination timing to plant corn into. That has been true every year. We go out and we dig some plants up every year, and we dig a lot at planting time to make sure our depth's right. So we may have had a combination of factors. I would say that that's a pretty big contribution. I don't have in front of me, but rye removes a pretty significant amount of soil moisture, especially as it gets closer to reproduction phases. The second question is, we have not noticed any differences in allelopathic interactions for our corn and soybeans and the weed suppression. Allelopathy typically affects small-seeded broadleafs. We are studying this more in alfalfa. So we have not done this specifically, looked at this for our systems-based study, nor have we looked at the differences in rye varieties, but I know there is some research available on that, and we can follow up with those studies as well. Great questions.
All right, thanks, Dan. But yeah, and then, well, I'm sure we'll have plenty more questions here, but Anna will turn it over to you here.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to show some similar data as Dan showed from Minnesota, a little bit on a planting green study, and then a little bit actually looking at the soil moisture in cover cropped treatments. So these are on-farm trials where we looked at planting green, and you can see our locations are all in western Minnesota, and we're only looking at soybeans. So maybe we'll get to that corn project next year. And this is actually, I'm sorry, this is an old slide, but we're in year 2 or 3 of 3. So we have quite a bit of data at this point, and we'll collect for another couple of years. So I'm going to show the rye biomass and the soybean yield next to each other. Our termination timings are pretty similar to what Dan have. We have the no cover crop treatment, terminating rye 1 to 2 weeks before planting, at planting, and after planting. And this is from 2023 soybeans. So here we're down in Yellow Medicine County, I think. And in this case, we grew quite a bit of biomass, not quite to Dan's expectations of 4,000 pounds, but we didn't see any effect on yield. Yield was the same all around. Um, on the other hand, we had a site up in Polk County where we hardly grew any biomass, and we still saw an effect on yield. I'm not going to show data from every site, but I have the summary there at the top that at 5 of 6 sites, that pre-plant termination timing protected the crop yield. And I just circled this to point out that I don't think in this case that it was the 25 pounds of rye biomass that was the big issue with lower yields in these plots, or even 70 pounds. As Dan pointed out, that's a pretty slim amount of biomass. So there's something else going on here, and I really liked the slide that Dan showed that showed the progressive limitations on crop yield, and cover crops are only one of the things that's limiting crop yield. So in our 2022 data, it really seemed like high biomass numbers like we saw in Yellow Medicine County in 2023 really dinged yield. But in 2023, we could have yield dings even without high biomass numbers. And that might have more to do with the kind of planter issues that Dan was talking about. These are all on-farm sites where the farmer is using their own equipment and managing the planting process themselves. So it's site-by-site variation. The other little data set I'm going to talk about is soil water that we measured in Waseca over the course of a couple of seasons. And in this case, we have tillage and cover crop treatments. We didn't have a cover crop treatment in the rib chisel system because the timing of fall tillage and cover crop establishment just don't really jive very well. So we just have cover crop treatments in a no-till and a strip till, and then we have that chisel plow treatment. This is the 2021 data. The no cover crop system is in orange, the cover crop system is in green, and I'm going to show 3 different depths of soil water content. So this is measured in terms of percent of the volume of the soil. So if you can picture a pie chart of the soil, I should have put it up here. We expect it to be half solids and half pores. And those pores can either be filled with air or water. So 50% volumetric water content would be saturated soil where all the available space is filled with water. These ones that are around 25%, those are, those are fine. I would say 25 to 35% is usually field capacity. And then these ones that dip down around 10, that's dry. So as you know, it was also dry in 2021. You can see the precip up here from Waseca. So that's the 10 centimeter thing. I'm not seeing a difference by cover crop. 20 or 30 centimeters, when we add that, then you start to see a slight increase with cover crop in the strip till system. And if you go down to 60 centimeters, then it switches again. So I'm not seeing a real strong signal of soil moisture with cover crop in this data. I'll show you another year of it so we can look at that too. Here's 2022. This time we have a little moisture data from pretty late in the fall where we had some soil samples, but we only have precip up through September. Again, this is the 10 centimeter data, looks very similar. Here's the 30 centimeter data, even more similar than 2021. And then the 60 centimeter data, where again, maybe that conventional system has a little bit of an edge over the cover crop system once you get deep. So I think my interpretation of this is that there's the push-pull of cover crops on the soil water balance. They're literally taking up water, but they're also protecting the soil surface where you have residue in place. So I think you especially see that if you try to interpret a difference right at that 10 centimeter level, which is just, the top 6 inches of soil, you're really seeing the competing effects of evaporation and the effects of uh, uh, the uptake from the cover crop over the course of the season. These all start in May, so we're not looking directly at cover crop water uptake. I'm sorry, I don't have good data on that from our state either. I will say the biomass numbers in these 2 years in Waseca were lower in the, 200 pounds an acre range, or probably even less in some treatments. So we're not looking at huge amounts of biomass or a huge treatment effect here. Okay, the other little bit of data that I wanted to share is my former grad student Bailey Tangen's work looking at the soil response to rain. So this is getting at the question of, can that soil that's got the good structure in a reduced tillage and cover crop system actually take in more water? Can we show that by monitoring before and after rain events? So Bailey's now an extension educator, so you have full reign to look her up and ask her questions about this, but I'm going to present a little summary of some of her data. This was collected at the Waseca SROC again, and then at 3 on-farm sites in Dundas, Cannon City, and Blooming Prairie. And each of these on-farm sites represented a long-term management contrast. This is a picture of the surface of one of those sites, where in this case we had long-term moldboard plow treatment, and in this case we had a long-term no-till treatment. So we had pretty drastic tillage differences as well as the incorporation of cover crops. This is less about cover crops, but I wanted to bring it up because it has to do with the long-term differences we expect to see in a soil health system. So again, we're looking at soil response to rain. We measured soil moisture and aggregates before the rain and after. And so the variable we're interested in is what's the difference between before rain and after rain. So a positive difference would mean increase in soil moisture or increase in soil aggregates. And a negative difference would mean that we lost moisture or lost aggregates, which would really be a problem after a rain, right? So this is generally what the volumetric water content looked like. These plots are similar in terms of that they're looking at volumetric water content percent. I'm just focusing on the surface in this case. We did see a little edge to our soil health sites in some years, but it's a little inconsistent overall. Again, there's those competing factors of evaporation versus residue cover, or versus the uptake of cover crops. So in this plot, my y-axis here is that change in volumetric water content, so the after rain minus the before rain. So these dots on top means that the soil increased in water content over time. The colors are the same with the conventional system in yellow and the soil health system in green, and those represent both tillage and cover crop differences now. And then the y-axis is the pre-rain volumetric water content. So how dry was the soil when you received the rain? And so what I think is interesting when you look at this is if you focus on, say, an area where you have a lot of dots that are both green and orange, the green line is higher than the orange line, meaning that you're getting a greater capture of water in that system. Now, we're not seeing that across the board in all of our systems, and I think that has to do with the length of time in these practices. The Blooming Prairie was the most stark difference in tillage differences, so it had really different soil structure, as you'll see as I talk about aggregates here next. So these are the water stable aggregates greater than 2 millimeters, so the larger elements of soil structure. These elements really get destroyed by intensive tillage passes because they physically get broken apart. Smaller aggregates tend to survive a tillage pass. So we think of these large aggregates as a good indicator of reduced disturbance and soil health system. You can see that the green lines are pretty consistently above the orange lines in this case. So we saw a pretty consistent response increase in aggregation for our soil health systems here. And then this is the same kind of plot as before, where the change in water stable aggregates or 2 millimeter aggregates after 24 hours represents that difference of measurements taken before and after rain. And this represents the condition before the rain. And here the difference is a little more stark when you have the same amount of aggregates before the rain. So let's look at this system this time because it has more dots that overlap. So you start with 50% of the soil and water stable aggregates. In the conventional system, those tended to melt away with the rain, essentially to dissolve because the glues weren't very strong. And in a soil health system, you actually tended to increase the aggregation after a rain. So the rain, instead of dissolving weak bonds, was able to promote a biological activity that actually created more glue for aggregates in those systems. Again, the response is different in different sites, and the big driver is what it looked like before the rain. But it does seem like we can have aggregates that have different quality, different strength, depending on whether you have a really high tillage system that incorporates cover crops or not. And then this is just one more piece of evidence about that, where we saw that we had overall larger pore sizes in Blooming Prairie and Cannon City. So here's the pore diameter, and this color represents the number of pores that are at that size. And the green ones for soil health skew to the right there, showing that they're overall larger. The last thing I wanted to bring up is that we're going to be doing a year-long cover crop academy starting in June. This is especially for CCAs, NRCS, soil and water district people, conservation agronomists, people who work with farmers on cover crops. So we'll put a link out, or you can look at the QR code here and let us know if you want to join us for that. A really cool thing about this is that we're going to actually have the participants design research treatments that we'll put out at our research and outreach centers in Crookston, Lamberton, and Waseca, and you'll get to watch them grow over the course of the fall 2024 to spring 2025.
All right. Thanks, Annie. I'm glad you're putting in a plug for the Cover Crop Academy. Like you say, that's registration's now open. You can pick your different site at the ROCs like Waseca or Lamberton or Crookston. So again, really neat opportunity. So check that out online. That just got out on our Minnesota Crop News. But anyway, we have some questions here for you as well related to your work, to a lot of interesting information here. One thing that came in is drainage tile considered in volumetric water retention. So again, does this tiling have an impact on what you're seeing?
So the Waseca plots where I showed the most soil moisture data, those are tiled. And we weren't comparing tiled to untiled situations. And because tiles didn't run very much in these drier years, I don't know that it would have made as much of a difference. But generally, yes, that metric would pick up the effect of tile in a wetter year, because you'd expect, especially that sort of middle level where it's not so much about evaporation, but about water moving down, you'd expect that to have lower volumetric water content. So yes, it would have showed up if we were comparing those things using that measurement.
All right. Oh yeah, and here's another one. Yeah, is the amount of subsoil drainage tiling the same at all your test sites? So in other words, is there a correlation between cover crop drainage and soil moisture?
The Dundas sites were not tiled. Those were hillier sites. Um, they weren't pattern tiled, I should say. They had some tile in some parts of the field. I don't think so. I don't think the drainage is what's driving the differences we
Mhm.
saw at our on-farm sites, because we had consistent tiling across the pairs.
Okay. And like you said, it's been very dry the last couple of years here too, for sure. And one question too that comes up in my head right away too, just with both of you, with Dan and Anna here too, like this planter issues. I know that's something that we've seen that happen in southeastern Minnesota big time in some of our cover crop trials. And just wondering if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that. Do you think that was more where we had cover crops, or was it just in general? What do you think was driving those issues with planter issues? Because again, I know on these trials we're looking at planting at different dates. So as planting was delayed, soils were more dry or more hard. But again, do you think what impact was cover crop having in that too? Uh, I'll
I
let you
can
go first, Dan, maybe. Here.
start off with this. So when we first started doing this work, we had a lot of people talking about how they were buying new planters or spending a lot to put all the fancy gadgets on planters to make this successful. And I really wanted to think about that in a different way because we have a lot of farmers that are using 4-row and 6-row equipment in the driftless region, and buying a new planter is not in their plans for the next few years. They have a very good planter. So we had a 1984 white brand planter at Lancaster, and we simply upgraded the double disc openers and the closing wheels. So we kept one stock closing wheel, and we added a spike closing wheel. That was kind of what we found based on the research for our silt loam soils at Lancaster would be best. That allows us to plant into ideal conditions. I realize that we're trying to plant maybe several thousand acres, and not every field and not every square inch of that field is going to be ideal. So that's where some of those other tools like hydraulic down pressure or air down pressure, the variable air ride, um, road cleaning wheels help out a little bit. That's where some of the different options for closing wheels work better in, say, clay soils than those spiked ones do. So that's really an on-farm decision that you have to make. Certainly, you don't have to go out and buy a new planter to plant in a rye residue, but you do have to get off the seat quite frequently when you start planting these high residue fields to make sure that you're getting depth correct and the rows getting closed. So if you watch some of the early YouTube videos on planting into high residue environments from the University of Wisconsin, there's some really interesting discussions of looking at those rows and seeing how it's pretty difficult to close a rye residue row over the top of soybeans and to get those soybeans planted at the proper depth. So planter adjustment's key. Taking some time this winter to make sure the planter is in optimal condition. Too often times we put the planter away and get the planter back out the next year, and we don't do a lot of maintenance, unfortunately, to that machine. Taking the time to make sure that the specifications are correct, especially on the double disc openers, is really key to getting that proper seed placement, looking for worn seed tubes. All that goes a long ways in making sure that we're successful in this system. Again, it's only one piece of the puzzle, but it does add up. So talk to your neighbors who are doing this and see what they're using for planter attachments to make this the best planter you can. And don't go out and buy a brand new planter unless yours is severely worn out and it is in the plan to replace. It's not necessary for these high residue environments. Just some minor adjustments are. And then I'll close with saying tying up the closing wheels with a bungee, like a heavy bungee cord or ratchet strap, has worked really well for us to make sure that we're placing the seed at the right depth for say 10 to 15 feet. It allows you to use a tape measure to measure seed spacing, and it allows you to ensure that seed depth is proper. Then you can move on to letting those closing wheels back down in the soil and then checking to make sure the pressure is set correctly on them to close the furrow.
Great comments. And I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on to that as well from what you've seen, especially with your
Just,
on-farm trials. And
just to summarize, I think Dan was hitting on this that it's a question of whether you want to spend your time or your money, right? I think a lot of times we think of these soil health systems as time, they require more intensive management, but you might end up saving money if you're reducing in tillage paths in the end. Or you don't have to replace your planter if you're willing to put in a little bit more time on these adjustments and getting out of the seed, as Dan says. So that's the trade-off, as he says, it's an on-farm decision. And then somebody had a more specific question, Dan, for you, I think, on do you adjust planting depth deeper or shallower than normal in fields with heavy rye residue?
So we want to plant to the same depth. So say we're going to plant corn 2 inches deep. We want to make sure that we're planting actually 2 inches deep. And that rye residue is going to make us set the planter deeper than that. So our normal 2 inch depth, if we have that same marked with a marker on our planter for quick infield checks, we're going to have to make that a lot deeper because those gauge wheels are going to ride on that rye residue. And what we've seen when we get to 4 to 6,000 pounds of rye residue, that can be as much as 3 inches of depth that we're going to have to adjust for. So I know that there are some planners that actually can't go that deep. So I would check to make sure that you have enough adjustment. Most of the machines I've seen have no problem doing that at all. But you do have to make quite a bit of adjustment there because of that rye residue is going to hold the gauge wheels up. And that's where we see our problems if we plant soybeans at, say, a half an inch deep instead of our 1.5 to 2 inches deep in some of these systems. So I'm not changing planting depth per se. Whatever you've been doing works great, but we are making sure that we're still planting to that actual depth.
well, that's a really good comment. And just related again to this whole moisture thing, because again, we're coming off a couple of really dry years, and we're not getting much moisture here. Certainly don't have any snow around here to speak of really either right now, or most parts of our state anyway. But just wondering too, do you have like biomass? What amount of biomass? Because again, you're talking about 4 to 6,000 boy, we'd love to have 4 to 6,000 pounds in a lot of our trials. It's hard to get that, but is there amount of biomass that you think we need to like reduce evaporation from the soil? But on the flip side, is there amount of biomass that you think we need to have that would really start to have an impact on, say, competition with the crop? I don't know, if you have any thoughts on that, Dan and Anna.
Anna, you can start with that one.
All right. Um, that's an active research question, Liz. I would say those thresholds are going to be different in every system and every crop. Um, One thing I'll say is that in terms of your competition with the crop, maybe you can get away from thinking about it with biomass if you're doing more precision planting, like if you're able to drill the cover crop down the row between crop rows. People have a lot of success with that in terms of minimizing the competition for water, for nutrients, et cetera, and also reducing the possibility to spread disease to the neighboring corn plants in particular from a rye plant. So that's one strategy to not to get some of the benefits in terms of soil coverage, reducing erosion, and reduce some of the negative issues.
Great comments. Dan, you have anything to add on to that, or?
Yeah, 100% agree with Anna. What we've been telling producers in southern Wisconsin that want to just hold the soil in place, if you can seed rye at 20 pounds per acre, or even maybe a little bit less in a mixture after, say, wheat, you're doing just fine. We're doing a bushel to try and get to that 4,000 pounds of biomass, but that's a lot of biomass if this is your first time planting cover crops. So certainly a lofty goal. Any amount of biomass that holds the soil in place is going to have some good benefits. We're
That,
just species selection is really important to get to that number too. We don't want to plant a species that's maybe not going to do much after, say, corn grain, that will winter kill because we'll be just disappointed in the amount of biomass produced.
that's a really good point that you bring up too about the seeding rates too, because again, like Anna said, that's really an active question that we're trying to get more information about. Because like yesterday when the front was coming through, there was like this wall and of dirt in that wall too that I drove through yesterday morning as the front came through. And I'm like, well, there's people's topsoil, and that's just not a good thing. So maybe that 20 pounds can help out, but we do need to find out some more research to figure that out too. But we do have some questions that came, and there's a question in the chat. I definitely want to get to that too. But some questions that had come through in our registration as well too. People were wondering, as we trudge through another drought, what can farmers do to make their soils more drought resilient? I don't know if you want to address that too. Any things in addition that we could do potentially?
I'll just point out that a lot of the resilience comes from reducing disturbance. You can think of it as like reducing the negative effects on soil structure and the cover crops being adding to the soil structure, right? So the first thing is to reduce the destruction of the soil structure. So that's a big one. Crop rotation can help in terms of breaking up disease cycles and also giving you windows for longer cover crops if you're able to get a small grain in there, or including perennials in a rotation like alfalfa or other forage crops. Again, it mixes up the kind of species that you have around, the kinds of roots that are exploring underground and building structure, and the kinds of biology you're able to support. So those are the big ones I'd point out.
Excellent. All right. Any thoughts you want to add on that, Dan, or?
Just remember that it's a fairly common practice, and I grew up in a very swampy region in northern Illinois, tile drain fields, drained in my grandfather's generation. Very common practice to till the field a couple times to dry it out. So that's something that we want to avoid and really be really strategic. Obviously, if we went through and we just ripped all of our ground last fall, we're going to have to smooth it off for a seed bed, but we want to be really strategic on how much time we spend out in those fields and what those tillage passes are going to do for soil moisture. So thinking about that long-term and resiliency, integrating cover crops, reducing disturbance, incorporating additional crops into our crop rotation is all things that we should be researching and exploring more to help build that resiliency.
Definitely. And any general recommendations you might have on timing of cover crop termination going into, again, since we've had a very dry years, and would they be different in corn and soybeans? Again, if you just wanted to summarize that, that's another question that had come in earlier as well.
Yeah, stay the course. So stay the course for your management plan if you've been doing this for a long time. You're the local expert. You've had success in the past. There's no reason to doubt yourself this coming season. If it does turn out to be another 2023, which I'm going to say optimistically, I think that we will get some more timely rains between now and then. But if we remain dry, I would terminate your cover crops before corn 2 weeks to 10 days beforehand, as long as they're actively growing. So we're seeing atmospheric conditions where the cover crops are growing is about 50 degrees during the night, say 60, 70 during the day. They're actively growing, they're actively taking up moisture. That way the herbicide translocates. Too many times we've had cases in southern Wisconsin where we go out and we spray and it gets down below freezing at night and the cover crop actually doesn't die. And then the herbicide is essentially evaporated or broken down by atmospheric conditions. So we don't see translocation occur. So if it's actively growing, terminate it early for corn. For soybeans, plant them together. Plant green, terminate whenever it works out to go out and make that sprayer pass. Manage for weeds though. Don't let weeds escape because herbicide activation could be difficult again this next year if it is dry. So have a plan for that and plan for herbicides that may adapt well to those conditions. I don't have that data in front of me to speak about today, but use some of the knowledge gained over the last few dry years to make those management decisions.
Yeah, and I think with your
Are
on-farm trials with the soybeans, sometimes, I mean, we can sometimes if
yeah.
it's really dry, we might terminate too late with soybeans too, that we've picked up, right?
Our
Um,
data so far in Western Minnesota in 2 dry years, so maybe we'll get a wet one for some variety, suggests that terminating before planting is going to be less risky. So that's what we're seeing over there. But I agree with Dan. If it's been working for you to plant green, then it's probably going to keep working for you. So you might have the oddball dry year again. But this might be, if it stays dry this spring, a year to err on the early side.
all right, and one more question here. So, can you adjust the effect of rye planting date on total biomass production, winter survival, and so forth? So, do we need to increase rye seeding rate as planting date gets into late October, November? And what's the ideal fall planting date for rye?
Liz, I feel like you and Axel did some stuff on this in
Yeah,
Southwest Minnesota at least.
that's right. Yeah, Axel Garcia at the Southern or Southwest Research Outreach Center in Lamberton has done a lot of research around this question. And yeah, basically, by mid-September, that's kind of our optimal planning date for rye that we've been finding. And once you get into October, you can still get establishment, but we are seeing less establishment, less biomass produced in the spring than if we would have been able to plant it in September. And seeding rate, we're trying to get more information on seeding rate as well. We don't have a lot of data on that yet. Um, but yeah, well, I should take a step back. We've looked at higher seeding rates, like 60 versus 90 versus 120. We don't need to go to the 120. We really don't need to go to the 90. We were trying to get maximum biomass to help with weed control. Devlin Sarangi has been involved with a lot of that work, our weed scientist. But again, so the 60, if we're looking for that for weed control. But again, those lower rates, that's an area up that we want to do more work on. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts to add onto that, but that's kind of it in a nutshell on that. And we do have another question about rye. Pretty much, it sounds like a lot of these trials have been done with rye. We've got several questions. You wondered if we have done, any other trials other than rye. If you have, are there any comments too about what other cover crops a person could try versus rye?
Rye is really reliable if you have a short window in a corn soybean rotation. Some people get nervous about it, transferring diseases or pulling up nitrogen before a corn crop, and that's another reason to maybe look at a lower rate or that precision planting between rows. But it's really reliable in terms of getting established and getting decent growth. And when you have a longer window after corn silage, after small grain, you can look at some more diverse mixes, sprinkling in a little legume or brassica in there, looking at oats, so you don't have to think about spring termination of your grasses. Dan might have some more specific stuff, but the world is your oyster if you have a longer winter or a longer window, and if you don't, then rye is a really safe choice. That's why we do a lot of research on it to make sure we're using it effectively.
We planted rye into almost frozen or freezing ground before at Lancaster, December 10th of 20. I think that was like 2019 or so. The fall was really long, and we had to get the rye in the ground because we were researching it. Was not ideal timing, but we had an excellent stand of rye come late April and early May to go ahead and plant into and continue our research study. So really a flexible cover crop, really a flexible small grain. Again, that's in southern Wisconsin, so this is not the same recommendation necessarily for the northern cropping belt of maybe even either state, but it has worked really well for us. Other species we've looked at, and we're doing a lot of work. We've done quite a bit of work on interseeding over the years, interseeding at V5, and then also overseeding at like um, about 2 weeks before silage harvest. And that's where you start to see a lot more flexibility in species. We've seen a lot of luck with aerial applications in parts of the driftless region with a brassica, a legume, and a grass species included in those mixes. So that planting window really does change a lot because your growing degree days change so much between the silage or small grain harvest and corn grain and corn and soybean.
Yeah, and I'll just add a few comments onto that too. I mean, there's a reason why we've looked at rye so much, like you guys have been saying. I mean, it's relatively inexpensive. It's pretty well available, and one of our most consistent species to get established. We've looked at cover crops planted in the middle of the year. You know, that's a little bit different situation. And again, working with Axel Garcia at Lamberton. And you know, if you're looking for forage production, again, that's a different goal. You know, I would say than say planting something in the fall. Again, that's rye's been kind of our go-to for that. Oh, and here we have a question. Any experiences seeding rye or other species into standing soybeans as the leaves turn yellow? So that later interseeding, you know, right when they're reaching physiological maturity.
I don't have any research on that, Liz, but haven't you guys done that again at Lamberton?
I'm trying to remember. I know that we've had some work. We worked with farmers on that as well. You know, a lot of
Yeah.
farmers have tried aerial seeding with that too.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, there again, moisture, it's so key. You have getting moisture after seeding is just a really key thing. And you're not able to use a drill, so you don't get that seed to soil contact. So sometimes it can work pretty well, and sometimes it hasn't worked so well. But I guess that's what I don't know, Dan, if you've had experiences with that as well.
We've done this. We did a trial at the Anmar Zoo up in Wausau, one of my first years with the nutrient pest management program, and I guess the producer liked the way our demonstration plots looked so well that they ended up seeding the entire field with an airplane, and that we didn't get any spring data because they seeded our plots too, but it worked really well. So picking species that do well
Yeah.
with surface applications is really important. But Liz, as you say, the soil moisture is really key for that. If you have some good conditions for planting on the soil surface, then you won't have any challenges in that system because you'll be harvesting the crop and then you'll have the soil to protect again. But we have tried that same system earlier in soybeans when they've still been green, and we've not had luck with that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I just like you say, I think it's something that a lot of people have been doing successfully. It's just, yeah, moisture is just a really big player in that. Just wanting to get enough moisture to get it established. One question that has been out here too that I would really like you guys to address too is just talking about with soybean cyst nematode. Have you sampled for nematode populations? And that ties with some other questions we got in earlier too at registration for this program. Do you have any comments, basically in general, you know, what impact cover crops could have on soybean cyst nematode populations? Are you seeing numbers increase or decrease? You know, any work done around that area?
Do you track this at all, Dan? It's not something I track, so I just looked it up.
No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I have not researched
Yeah.
this or done anything out in the field on this.
No worries. Well, what
Okay.
I looked up was a series of really careful studies from Greg Tilka down in Iowa, where they essentially looked at different cover crops' effect on soybean cyst nematode reproduction in a lot of greenhouse studies for the most part. And they basically didn't find a consistent effect of cover crops on SCN. Sometimes the SCN reproduction did go down after cover crop. And sometimes they found that it could be an effective trap crop, especially crimson clover seemed to, um, get the nematodes to latch onto that clover. So then maybe they wouldn't still be around when you got to the soybean crop. So they probably are going to have an effect in some fields, but there's nothing really consistent out there in terms of this is a cover crop that will either slow them down or trap them to distract them from your soybeans.
All right. Yeah. Good research there, Anna. And here's another question again. I know we're getting a little bit out of the moisture, but this does deal with moisture relations too, because we're talking about a disease. We've got to have the right conditions for it to be able to develop. But are there any cover crops that help with white mold control in soybeans? Have you seen anything or heard of any work or done anything, around diseases like white mold in cover crops?
We spent 2 years researching this, Liz, and
Mm,
unfortunately the disease triangle was not met either one of those years, so we didn't have any white mold. But
okay.
other research would say that it does help suppress those mushroom type spores out in the field. And Damon Smith's done some additional work on this. We did sample the entire study for essentially the white mold spores. That data is not wrapped up yet, but we did spend 2 years on this, just didn't have the right conditions for white mold, so very site specific.
Okay. Yep. Very good answers here. And I'm just trying to see if there's other questions here that are there any, as I'm looking through our questions here, we've got a number of questions. Are there any other comments that you want to add or any thoughts too that you'd like to add on into the mix here? Oh, and we have another one here. Are you involved with any research with winter camelina and pennycress cover crops? How might harvestable cash cover crops affect soil nutrient cycling differently than non-harvested cover crops? So yes, there's been a lot of work with winter camelina. Maybe more so than with pennycress, but a little bit of both. But any comments that you want to share on those?
I'm
Um,
not working directly with them, but in theory, they should work the same way. Dan and I have talked a lot about biomass today, and your different amounts of biomass you get from these different crops will give you different outcomes in terms of weed control, nutrient cycling, soil health benefits. Harvesting the grain, could be just another element of disturbance in the system. So that could just give you a little bit more destruction. The other thing is that you might lose a little bit of biomass through that harvest, more like that rilage treatment that Dan showed briefly in one of his slides. So it'll just depend how this works out, how much biomass the final varieties end up producing. Right now, the overwintering success hasn't really been so great, so they haven't produced a ton of biomass and probably are not affecting the soil and nutrient cycling too much, just relative to that biomass.
yeah.
I'm not working on pennycress specifically, but we are really interested in the nutrient cycling component of cover crops, and we're taking a lot of biomass samples and analyzing those for nutrient removal. Um, what we can say though is whenever we're harvesting a crop, we're removing those nutrients from the field, unless we're feeding those to a livestock species and applying the manure back onto that field. That's going to complete the nutrient cycle. So if we're harvesting, say, pennycress and removing that from the field, removing that grain from the field, then we're not going to be able to replace that nutrient value without an application of nutrients if needed based on soil testing. Now, if we have high phosphorus and potassium levels, we're drawing them down. There's nothing wrong with that to draw them down to a reasonable level, especially in our livestock farms. But if we're just growing that as a cover crop, we're letting that biomass accumulate nutrients. Eventually, those nutrients will cycle back, and that's what we're really interested in. We're not going to have all the answers by any means, but this is, I think, a pretty active area for research right now. So more to come.
Right. And I did want to add a few comments. I mean, I have been involved with research trials, again, with Devlin Strange, our weed scientist, for one thing. And I know Axel Garcia at Lamberton has done work with camelina as well. But yeah, like with the winter camelina, we had that establishment at Rosemont, I believe, was one where it had established really well, seeded in the fall and came in the spring. And there we were looking at from a weed management perspective, but of course there's been other research done where you're trying to harvest it, for the seed, get the oil. And so the soybean yield was impacted a little bit by having the camelina, but the oil production per acre was greater than if you would have just had soybeans, for example. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential. Forever Green, very actively involved with these projects. So I guess anybody who's interested in that, I do encourage you to check out that information too, because I think there's a lot of potential with the camelina and the pennycress too, as we get these more ready to be something that we can put on more acres throughout the state and have the whole market and everything developed. But I'm looking at the time here. Are there any other comments that you want to add here before we wrap things up today? Any parting thoughts or comments? Dan, I'll ask you first here. Um,
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Anna. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And if you're doing these systems, look at them year round with a shovel out in the field. Go out and collect some of your own data on your own farm. Look at soil moisture. If you have a soil thermometer, that's a very useful tool as well to look at some of these systems. Collect some data on your farm. I challenge you to go out and dig some roots this spring and summer.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep. Thanks,
Yeah, I'll
Dan.
just add, we had a few questions that came in beforehand that talked about essentially how do I do this in a corn soybean rotation? It's really hard. There's barely enough time. And I guess I just encourage you to a couple of things. First, prioritize the cover crop as a crop. So chase the combine with the drill if that's your option is to plant after harvest. It's worth your time because it's replacing that fall tillage pass. So think about it as something that you can prioritize in your system. And then also look. Another question that came up in our pre webinar questions was a lot about economics. And so again, thinking about the whole system. Are you replacing tillage? Are you changing your labor patterns so that you have kind of less to do in the spring if you're not doing as a field cultivator pass or a spring tillage pass to prepare the field because of your cover crop? How does that change how patient you can be about planting? So think about the whole system, I guess is my point, and not just the cost of the seed and the cost of the herbicide to terminate the cover crop. Those are parts of the system, and you should look for cost share where you can to alleviate that cost, especially as you're starting out. But think about the whole system in terms of economics, labor, tilth, hassle, all the elements that it's going to change on your farm.
Yeah, thank you too, Anna. Thanks, Dan too. And yeah, and I'll add a comment. We should have a resource page which has like our cover crop recipes. Those are on the Midwest Cover Crop Council, kind of easy entry points for cover crops. So again, if you're interested in getting started in cover crops, I really encourage you to check out. It's a great website, a lot of nice resources. Of course, our extension cover crop website as well, but we have those cover crop recipes for Minnesota in there. And with the economics, that's really an interesting point to bring up too. Again, as I was driving into the big wall of, and I'll call it dirt when it's up in the air blowing around. I mean, what's the long-term impacts of that, of losing our topsoil, So this was another year where, snert came up with dirt and soil too. And again, just having something there to protect our topsoil, that's definitely a long-term economic impact there. But again, and there's a more technical question. Maybe Dan, or Anna, you want to answer that one, and asking about soil moisture sensors. But I will wrap this up here again. I'd like to thank everybody and especially thank our speakers. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Anna. And thank you all for attending today. And again, thanks to our sponsors, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, for making this possible.